You have a session that introduces CSS grid layout. What is that and why is it important?
So the CSS grid layout is a new spec, an emerging spec. It originally came from Microsoft, and in fact there's an early implementation of it in IE 10 and 11. It's kind of moved on now, and it's really a specification for laying out web pages and web applications, and it's something that we haven't really had up to now. The specs, the sort of things we're using for layout, things like float and so on, really are quite a lot of hacks to get them to work. And so developers have been working around this stuff for years. And so grid I'm quite excited about, because it's sort of for the first time it feels like a real modern way of doing layout on the web.
So it takes something that was a bit hacky for a while and makes it somewhat official?
Well, that's it, because layout just hasn't really moved on, and the reason it hasn't moved on is because it's actually very, very difficult to start using a new layout method, because your layout doesn't work if the browser doesn't support it. So that's kind of why I think this has been held back, and we can do so much other cool stuff in CSS now. You know, we can do gradients and animation and all sorts of things, and yet we're still hacking around layout, this sort of basic structure of the web. You know.
So this alleviates some of that.
Yeah.
That's great. Responsive design, do you feel like it's a destination? I mean, is it the culmination of everything we've been working toward, or is it a step towards something that will ultimately become the default?
This is one of those kind of crystal ball questions, isn't it? You know.
We're going to hold you to it too, of course.
Yeah. You know, I don't know, because things are going to change again. You know, we're starting to look at these smartwatches and things like the Apple Watch. I mean, you know, how do these layouts then work on these tiny devices? And I think it's been a real step forward in terms of people stopping thinking about a web page as being a fixed thing. I think one of the biggest things that responsive design's done is it's stopped people from saying, well, here, I've got my Photoshop document. Make me a website that looks like this, exactly like this, and it will display like this in all browsers. And with responsive design, we get away from that because, well, it just doesn't, and it can't. And it's going to be different on all these devices. And so I think it's been a huge step forward for the web and how we see web pages and how we understand how these things work. But what happens next? You know, who knows? I mean, who knows what devices we'll have? I mean, you know, 5 years ago we were just getting to grips with phones, and in fact people were going to use the web on their phones. You know, in 5 years' time, what on earth are we going to be looking at? You know, so it's very difficult to say, and I think it's what makes it exciting. I've been doing this since 1996, and I still love what I do and love finding out about these things. So.
Now, your session description says that you think that all developers should take an interest in emerging specifications. Why is that worth studying?
Because if you don't start looking at these things at the point at which they're being developed and they're starting to be implemented in browsers, if you don't start looking at them then, you can't really wait until it's there and it's implemented and it's a spec that's gone through the process and then say, oh, this doesn't do what I need. And it's so easy these days. I mean, with grid layout, it's in Chrome. It's behind a flag, and you can turn it on. You can start playing with it as a developer. You don't have to sort of imagine how it's going to work. You can play with it, and you can feed back. And so that's why I think it's important for us to get our hands on stuff, play with it, and get back to the people who are creating the spec and the people who are implementing it and saying this doesn't work for what I need, at a point at which you can feed back.
Is it because the specs have that feedback mechanism so that you can discover interactions, you can discover new ways of using it?
Yeah, and then you can post to the mailing list and say, well, I've been trying to build something. I mean, I've been doing that as I've put together some examples and saying, well, this is where I could do with this property, and as a developer, that's sort of useful to the spec writers, because a lot of them, they're not working developers, they're spec writers. And so I think it's important. I'd love to see more people who are much more design focused looking at these things and giving feedback, because ultimately we're going to use them to implement.
Interesting.
So yeah, I think it's good for people to get to grips with this stuff.
Kind of related to that, I'm sort of going off the path here a little bit, but with a spec, is spec actually the wrong word for it? I mean, does that imply that it's going to come down from on high and then you're going to use it?
I think people feel that that's the case, and it isn't really. I mean, it can be sometimes, but I think most of the time these specs go through a process which is open, and we do, as developers, get a chance to feedback, just as browser vendors get a chance to feedback. I mean, the specs, they're for two groups, aren't they? There's people like me who are just building websites, and then there's people who are the browser vendors and who are actually implementing the spec in the browser so it will render the stuff that I build. And the specs are there really that those two groups can be working with them. And it's a real shame if developers don't sort of have their 2 cents worth, because you can.
Sure.
And you know, I think we're seeing a bit more of that. I mean, things like the responsive images stuff and things, you know, where actual developers got together and said, we need this, and started working on it.
The first edition of your book, the CSS Anthology, came out in 2004, is that right?
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, what has surprised you about CSS's development over the last 10 plus years now?
And I think it comes back to this thing with layout, you know, the fact that we're still, really, the layout methods we're using haven't moved on much since I wrote that book, which is kind of terrifying. I mean, when I wrote the book, I was having to argue for not using tables for layout, as to be said, and the first edition was full of, you know, this is why you don't use tables, and as I rewrote it, you know, that kind of was taking a back seat. I mean, that first edition had things for coping with Netscape 4 in it still, because it was still around. You know, there were still pockets where, particularly sort of, I think, academic sites and things, you know, where it was still being used. So now, you know, I think a lot of people aren't worrying about IE6 and IE7 these days. So, but the fact that this layout thing we're still really dealing with layout that kind of is sort of circa 2005, you know. Wow. And I think that's why, you know, I've been so enthusiastic about the grid layout, because I see that you know, in conjunction with Flexbox, has been really the way forward.
Kind of related to all this, what is the biggest web or coding issue that you're running into now?
I think the sort of big issue that we're seeing is the diversity of experience and sort of understanding of the web. And I see this in my sort of day job, because I'm a CMS vendor. We have a content management system product. So we support our users who are building websites for clients. And in our forum, I really see this huge difference between people who can barely write HTML, yet are building sites for clients and have very little understanding and engagement with all of this stuff, the stuff that we really care about and we think is really important. They just want to build websites, and they don't care how they do it, really. They're not worried about standards or specifications or whether something's modern or not. They're just building websites. And then, you know, we have people who can't start a project without a framework and, you know, task runners and all this sort of stuff. So there's a huge diversity now in people who are building for the web, I think more so than ever. And I kind of worry that we're sort of cutting off those easy entries into becoming a really good web developer, because you kind of need so much stuff now, or it seems like, you know, you read any tutorial and it's sort of like, oh, you need Grunt and you need all these different things. You can't just write CSS. And I got into the web just because I wanted to build websites, and I viewed source and I started building websites. And I want to make sure, because you still can do that, and I'd like to make sure there's still those easy routes in, so that people can start playing with things and don't feel the need to have, you know, a huge stack of stuff before they can actually write a line of HTML, because that's not true. So I think there's a bunch of sort of issues around that, about how do we get people into the industry, how do we get people to do it well, and how do we make sure that the education goes right across from people who really, really just care about delivering sites to their clients and aren't that worried or engaged with new things, and then people who are really up there and really want to have the latest cutting edge stuff. You know, it's sort of balancing all that.
How about 5 years ago? What was the big thing that you were dealing with at that point? And hopefully, how did it get addressed? I think really it was that battle with what do we do about these phones? Because I think it's about 5 years next month, I think, is when, you know, Ethan's article went out on List-Apart. So, you know, back then we really didn't, I don't think we knew what to do about the phones, you know, and in that situation we're building these separate mobile sites. Right. And it almost felt that we were going back to that point where, you know, in the sort of browser wars days, when we were building 2 sites, one for Netscape, one for IE, and I can remember thinking, we're going to be doing this with phones. We're going to be detecting, is this an iPhone or is this a feature phone, and we're going to be building all these sites. And I think the responsive design thing really kind of solved that, certainly for now, in that yes, you can build one site, and because I think there really was a danger that we were going to start building multiple representations of all of our websites, and people were starting to do that for phones. So Glad
I think
it didn't work out that way.
I think we sidestepped that a bit, you know, with responsive design. You know, there are issues of performance and things like that, and things that we're kind of still trying to work out as a community. But I think it's probably the best thing we have to tackle the issue at the moment.
Last question for you. What people or projects are you following these days?
People, Sarah Sweden, who's a developer in the Lebanon, she's doing some fantastic front-end stuff. Her articles are just wonderful. I think she's a really great sort of new face on the scene, as it were. And there's quite a few times I'm talking about things and, on stage, I say, I'd have built an example, but Sarah's just done a great article here, so, go look at this. This is better than anything I would do. She's doing some wonderful stuff, and she's speaking at quite a few conferences and things. It's really great to see sort of, younger people coming through and new people with ideas. So she's really great. And then the other stuff I'm very interested in is performance generally. I've always been very keen to see the web being available to everyone. That's been something that right through my career I've cared about, and we're seeing people in certain areas of the world where sort of feature phones are really the main way people are accessing the web, and how do we make sure that we get all excited about all this new stuff and we get excited about our shiny new devices that we have and the fact that we've got higher bandwidth a lot of the time and things. But how do we make sure that the stuff we're building is also useful around the world and for everybody, and not just for people who've got the money to spend on the latest iPhone? So I'm very interested in performance generally, which is something we're doing a lot of with our own product. And that's the sort of projects I'm looking at following.
Great. Well, thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you.